History remembers a lot of men who ruled the water, but John Lafitte was never just another captain with a cutlass and a grudge. In February of 1823, the record books closed the file on him for good. The story goes that he was cut down in a night battle off the coast of Honduras, bleeding out on the deck of his own schooner while cannon smoke rolled across the water. His name, his fleet, his legend, all of it, gone in a single paragraph of naval correspondence. Except, what if I told you that while the world was busy writing his obituary, John Lafitte was sitting in a quiet house near the Mississippi River, sharpening a hammer instead of a sword, already 3 years into a brand new life? This is the story of a man who didn't just outrun the British Navy, the Spanish Crown, and the United States government. He may have outrun death itself. Today, we're pulling apart the evidence that historians have argued over for 150 years: the letters, the journal, the blacksmith who cried when a stranger called him captain. Some of it is proven fact. Some of it is legend-wearing facts clothes. By the end of this video, you decide which is which. Welcome aboard. If you're new here, this channel exists for exactly one reason: to drag the real history out from underneath the Hollywood version and hand it back to you raw. If that sounds like your kind of trouble, hit subscribe and ring the bell, because today's story about to get very strange. Let's raise the flag on John Lafitte. To understand why a man might fake his own death, you first have to understand what his own country did to him while he was still alive. John Lafitte was born somewhere around 1780, and even that is disputed. Some records point to France. Others point to the French colony of Saint-Domingue in the Caribbean, the island that would later become Haiti. Wherever he came from, by his mid-20s, Lafitte and his older brother Pierre were running a smuggling operation out of a blacksmith shop in New Orleans, a front for moving stolen goods, contraband, and enslaved people through the bayous south of the city. By 1810, the brothers had turned Barataria Bay into their own private kingdom, a warren of islands and waterways too shallow for Spanish warships and too dangerous for anyone else to bother chasing them into. For a few years, Lafitte wasn't just a criminal. He was the closest thing the Gulf Coast had to a shadow government. Ships came and went. Goods moved through New Orleans at prices the legal merchants couldn't match. Everyone knew where the smuggled sugar and the smuggled silk came from, and everyone bought it anyway. Then, in 1814, the British came calling. They needed men who knew the swamps and the shipping lanes, and they offered Lafitte money, rank, and protection if he'd help them take New Orleans. He turned them down flat, and instead sent the offer straight to the American governor as a warning. It didn't matter. The Americans raided Barataria anyway, burned his ships, and threw his men in jail. And then, weeks later, General Andrew Jackson needed exactly what Lafitte had: cannons, gunpowder, and men who actually knew how to aim. Lafitte and his Baratarians manned the guns at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815, and by most accounts their marksmanship was a major reason the battle turned into a massacre of the British forces rather than a defeat for the Americans. Jackson was so impressed he asked President Madison to pardon every one of them. Madison agreed. For one shining moment, John Lafitte was a hero. Newspapers praised him. Politicians shook his hand. And then, quietly, the same government that pardoned him refused to return what had been seized from him. His base at Barataria was gone. His fortune scattered. The land, the goods, the ships. The United States kept its patriotism and kept his property too. The man who had helped save New Orleans was left standing on the docks with a pardon in one hand and nothing else in the other. That is the moment, historians argue, that something in Lafitte changed for good. He rebuilt a smuggling base on Galveston Island in Spanish Texas, sailing now under letters of marque from revolutionary governments fighting Spain. But the trust was gone. He had learned permanently that loyalty to any flag was a losing bet. If a country could use you and discard you once, it would do it again. From that point forward, John Lafitte stopped believing in nations. He only believed in staying one step ahead of them. By 1820, the U.S. Navy forced him out of Galveston too. He burned his own settlement to the ground rather than leave it standing for someone else, loaded what treasure he had left onto his ship, and sailed south into the Gulf. He would never set foot in the United States as John Lafitte again. Here is where the official story ends and where the real mystery begins. The last confirmed sighting of Lafitte places him off the coast of Honduras in early February of 1823, commanding a schooner named the General Santander under a Colombian privateering commission. On the night of February 4th, low visibility and two vessels that appeared to be fleeing merchant ships turned out to be heavily armed Spanish privateers, and Lafitte's crew found themselves in a brutal, close-range firefight. According to the naval reports that survive, Lafitte was wounded that night and is believed to have died sometime after dawn on February 5th. Notice the language. Believed to have died. Not confirmed. Not witnessed. Believed, no body was ever recovered by American or Spanish authorities. No grave was ever identified. No official burial record exists anywhere in the Gulf of Mexico for the most wanted smuggler in American history. For a man whose entire adult life had been meticulously documented in newspapers, court records, and government correspondence, his ending is a single vague sentence in a single report, written by people who were not present when it happened. Ask yourself something. This was a man who had already faked his allegiance to two empires, played the British and the Americans against each other, and burned down his own settlement rather than hand it over intact. Is it really so hard to believe that a man like that might understand the value of a convenient, unconfirmed death? Rumors started almost immediately. Some said he had been killed by his own crew shortly after leaving Galveston. Others whispered that he had simply vanished and resurfaced under a new name. A few outlandish tales even claimed he had somehow rescued Napoleon Bonaparte, and the two of them lived out their days together in Louisiana. Most of that is nonsense. Born from a culture that couldn't accept that its most famous outlaw had just quietly disappeared. But buried underneath the nonsense is one thread that historians still argue about today, because unlike the Napoleon rumor, this one came with paperwork. In 1948, a man named John Lafflin, a railroad engineer living in Kansas City, Missouri, came forward claiming to be the great-grandson of John Lafitte. He said his family had quietly preserved something for generations, a journal, written in French, along with a family Bible that traced a bloodline the world had assumed ended off the coast of Honduras. According to Lafflin, John Lafitte hadn't died in that battle at all. He had survived it, or arranged for the world to believe he hadn't, and eventually made his way north into the American interior toward the Mississippi River Valley, where a man with a French accent and a talent for reinvention could disappear into plain sight. The journal told a story almost too strange to be believed. That Lafitte took the name John Lafflin. That he remarried, that he built a quiet, respectable life as a tradesman, using the same hands that had once loaded cannons to now work iron and steel. In 1952, historian Stanley Clisby Arthur published a biography drawing on this material, and even sent samples to the Library of Congress, where an examiner confirmed the paper itself was consistent with the early 19th century. Consistent paper does not prove the story true. Handwriting can be practiced. Journals can be written decades after the fact by a man who wanted a more interesting family history than the one he actually had. Mainstream historians, to this day, do not endorse the Lafflin journal as genuine. But they haven't been able to fully dismiss it either. And that unresolved tension is exactly why this story refuses to die. Because here's the detail that keeps pulling people back in. Whoever wrote that journal knew things. Details about Lafitte's early years, his relationships, the texture of his criminal operations that weren't widely published anywhere in 1948. Either someone did an extraordinary amount of obscure historical research decades before the internet existed and built an elaborate hoax around it, or the person writing it down had actually lived it. Quick pause, because I want to be straight with you about something. Everything I'm walking you through today, the journal, the naval reports, the family records, it's scattered across archives. Private collections, and out-of-print books that most people will never get their hands on. I've spent months pulling this material together into one place, organized by pirate, by port, by year, so you don't have to hunt for it the way I did. If you want to go deeper than any single video can take you, there's a link in the description. All right, back to the Blacksmith. Picture a small town along the Mississippi River sometime in the 1830s. A quiet, well-dressed man runs an ironworking shop. He's polite, a little formal, speaks with an accent nobody can quite place. He doesn't talk about his past. He pays his debts. He goes to church. If you didn't know better, you'd think he'd lived there his whole life. The story, as the journal tells it, is that one day an old acquaintance walked through that door. A face from a life this man had supposedly buried off the coast of Honduras. And without thinking, the visitor said a single word: "Captain." According to the account, the blacksmith's hands stopped moving. His eyes filled. And instead of denying it, instead of laughing it off as a case of mistaken identity, he simply raised a finger to his lips and asked the man to leave quietly and never speak of it again. Whether that exact scene ever happened, no one can prove. But think about what it represents. A man who had commanded fleets, fought a legendary battle, been pardoned by a president and then robbed by that same country, forced to abandon 2 separate strongholds, and finally driven to fake his own death in the Gulf of Mexico, reduced to hoping that nobody in a small river town would ever recognize his face. That is not the ending of a triumphant pirate king. That is the ending of a man running from his own legend, trading cannon fire for the sound of a hammer on an anvil, trading a fortune in stolen gold for the quiet privilege of being left alone. If the story is true, John Lafitte didn't get away with piracy. He got away from it. And the price of that freedom was that the most famous version of himself had to die, so a quieter, poorer version of himself could live. The Lafflin family Bible, referenced in later accounts, records a marriage and children under the Lafflin name. If this thread of the story holds, John Lafitte's bloodline didn't end in an unmarked grave in Central America. It continued, generation after generation, under a name that meant nothing to anyone, which was exactly the point. So let's ask the obvious question. Why would a man with Lafitte's resources, his reputation, his connections, choose an anvil over a throne? Consider the bounty on his head. By the early 1820s, Lafitte had angered the United States, Spain, and virtually every merchant fleet operating in the Gulf. A price like that doesn't expire. It follows you for the rest of your life, and it follows your family after you. Every port he entered under his own name was a gamble. Consider the timing. By the mid-1820s, the golden era of Gulf piracy was already collapsing under coordinated naval pressure from multiple governments. The world that had made John Lafitte possible was disappearing fast, and a man that intelligent would have seen it coming. Better to vanish on your own terms than get dragged into a courtroom, or worse, a public hanging. As an example to the next generation of smugglers, and consider his legacy. As a wanted pirate, his story ends in a noose or a bloody deck. As a man who was never caught, whose death was reported but never confirmed, he becomes something far more powerful in the American imagination: a ghost. Unfinished stories don't fade, they grow. But there is one piece of evidence that could theoretically settle this once and for all, and it's the piece that keeps this mystery alive on forums and in documentaries even today. Decades after John Lafflin died, researchers interested in the connection to John Lafitte pushed for something modern science could offer that 19th century witnesses couldn't: genetic testing. If descendants of the Lafflin line could be compared against verified descendants of the Lafitte family, the mystery could theoretically be closed for good, one way or the other. It has never happened in any way that satisfies mainstream historians. Records are incomplete. Family lines are difficult to verify. The Lafitte Society and academic historians remain openly skeptical of the entire Lafflin claim, and no peer-reviewed genetic study has ever confirmed the connection. The official historical position, even today, is that John Lafitte most likely died from wounds suffered in that battle off the coast of Honduras in February of 1823. But most likely is not the same as certain. And in the absence of certainty, the story survives. Maybe John Lafitte really did bleed out on the deck of the General Santander, and everything that came after is just a beautifully constructed story that a lonely man in Kansas City wanted to believe about his own family. Or maybe, somewhere along the Mississippi, a pirate king really did trade his cutlass for a hammer, and spent the rest of his life listening for footsteps that never came. We may never know for certain which version is true, but that uncertainty is exactly why, 200 years later, we're still telling his story. What do you think? Did Lafitte die at sea, or did he disappear into a quieter life under a different name? Tell me in the comments, because I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this, the kind that live in the gap between history and legend, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.